Welcome to HP at Church, a podcast about Harry Potter and the Bible. This is our 9th and final episode in the time after Pentecost, also known as Ordinary Time of Year C. This is also our final episode of Season 2 of the podcast. Next time you hear us, we'll be starting Season 3 with Advent of Year A of the Revised Common Lectionary. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs.
In this episode, we'll talk about the 22nd and 23rd Sundays of the season after Pentecost, and Reign of Christ, the final Sunday of the church year. We do have one content notification for you this episode. During the second reading of the 23rd Sunday after Pentecost, the second Sunday that we'll be talking about in this episode, there will be a conversation involving ableism in interpretation of the Bible.
If you want to follow along on our blog, it's hpatchurch.wordpress.com, and you can find links to the Bible passages we're using and more information on other references we make in this episode.
Our first Sunday for this episode is the 22nd Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Proper 27, also known as Lectionary 32, and this year it falls on the 10th of November. Our first reading for this Sunday is from Job, chapter 19, verses 23 through 27a. I know that my Redeemer lives, proclaims Job, in the face of many losses and ongoing personal suffering.
So one of the perhaps more obvious themes based on the quote that you used in the summary is redemption. And I think this passage in general, and Job in general, is a fascinating one for Christians to think about because we believe in resurrection and Job likely didn't. But there's this sense of redemption as the one who redeems lives. And I think Snape is really like the one character that either needs or receives redemption in a big way. Like there are ways in which Harry does, but that's because of like all of the complexities of the Daily Prophet and that sort of thing. But like Snape, everyone thinks he's a Death Eater, and so the redemption that he gets, that he has been a double agent the entire time, is huge. It's this big shift in how the entire magical world is thinking about him.
Right.
And it happens after he's dead.
Yeah, redemption is not always, something that you yourself get to enjoy. When we reach verse 23, at the beginning of the reading, I was starting to work on the readings for this episode, and I looked at this one and I realized, oh, this sounds familiar. Because I very recently, I think last month, attended a funeral for a librarian that used this text, which I thought was a lovely choice. Especially since the beginning of this passage talks about wanting your words to be written down in a book. It was really great.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And that makes me think of Irma Pintz, Hogwarts librarian. And we don't really get to see a lot of her or her personality other than, being a little terrifying, which frankly, if I was the Hogwarts librarian, I think I would be a little terrifying. But
also every librarian I've ever talked to is like, she is the worst librarian ever.
Yeah, in terms of not like helping people find things and things like that, yeah.
Discouraging people from actually being in the library.
Right. I can only imagine what corralling both magical students and magical books must be like, especially given the description of some of those books that we're given, and like the Monster Book of Monsters and so on. We don't really get to see a lot of, who she is and why she became who she is and all that. And it would be nice to have some more of her words written down so that we could know more of who she was. Having our words written down does matter, and it can make a difference.
Yeah, I love that. And the way that the things we write down and the things we don't write down, and who we wish we had the words from. I have my grandparents, when they first met, my grandfather was in the Navy, and they got married like 6 months after they met.
Wow.
They met when my grandmother was engaged to somebody else.
Oh, goodness.
Like, their story is like a Nicholas Sparks novel. But one of the things that we have is a lot of the letters that they wrote back and forth while he was overseas. after he had been shipped out. And like those letters mean so much to our family,
Right.
and the little drawings in them and the things written and stuff. And one year I typed them all out and then made them into scarves for my mom and my aunt so that they would be wrapped in the warmth of their parents' love. That one was like, I won Christmas that year. Like, hardcore. It was awesome. But yeah, like, which words we write down and don't write down and how they impact people.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, I was thinking in verse 23 about J.K. Rowling, right? And wondering if she ever wishes her words weren't written down. Right, like, I think in general she would never go back on publishing Harry Potter.
Right. I mean, if she did, she would be much more financially worse off, among other things.
Yes. And, like, I think in general, the trade-off of, like, all of the pressure that she faces and all of the other things that go on because of Harry Potter is probably worth it for her. But I definitely, like, wonder the number of times she has said or done terrible things on Twitter or in several of her, like, public social media-ish things. Yeah, I just wonder if she ever wishes her words hadn't been written down, or that she could unwrite them down instead of with iron pen and lead. And
yeah. In verse 24, when you look at the history of the Bible, Job is believed to have been the first of the books of the Bible to ever be written down, as in it's even older than Genesis. Actually, we're pretty sure, I think, that it's much older than Genesis. This story goes back a very long way. And we don't know how much the story has changed with typos and people writing down many different copies of it and so on over the years. But it might as well have been written with iron pen, because it seems to have lasted forever so far. Between invisible writing and quick quotes quills and so on, I bet that the magical world also has a spell or a charm or some method that preserves words so that they can't be erased or altered. And I also, as a side note, wonder if that's used for magical tattoos. But I wonder if there's some way of preserving, say, books to make sure that they won't be changed or erased or altered. I looked for it previous to recording this episode, but I wasn't able to find it. There was a very brief fanfic that I read years and years ago that has always stuck with me, about the Weasley twins see the librarian Irma Pintz doing something, and she impresses them, and so they offer their help if she needs any help with anything, and she immediately puts them on this is set in book 5. She immediately puts them on enchanting all of the books in the library with anti-burning spells so that they can't be burned in case Umbridge goes on a censorship rampage.
yeah.
Actually, as I remember it, I think the thing that they see her doing is destroying the records of who has borrowed what books, because she doesn't want Umbridge to have access to those records. Interestingly enough, this was also written during the time when the Patriot Act was trying to convince librarians to give up exactly that kind of information. Funny how that works.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't find it again, which is a shame, because it really made an impact. But I love the idea of being able to have a spell or something like that that can keep your books in good shape. Goodness knows a lot of mine have been battered over the years and could probably use something like that.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I like those sorts of things, particularly for characters like Madame Pince, because Harry is an unreliable narrator. She gets the raw end of the deal when it comes to, like, how she is portrayed in the books.
Yeah.
Because Harry, of course she's, like, Harry causes so much trouble. Of course she's going to be, like, super anxious and cautious about him, on top of all of the anxiety and cautiousness of other stuff.
Yeah, I mean, Hermione has some impact on him, but he is still not exactly a perfect library patron, and Ron certainly isn't. I imagine that Hermione and Madame Pince got along just fine, but we don't actually get to see much of that.
I actually think that their relationship would take a little bit of a dig as she gets more involved with Ron and Harry.
Yeah, probably.
But I do think, like, it's really fun to think about who they are and how they change and all of those things. I was thinking about, in verse 24, when I was reading that, I was thinking about the engraved on a rock forever and thinking about the gravestones in Godric's Hollow. From what I just Googled, it's St. Jerome's Cemetery in Godric's Hollow. I think there are different places where we get things engraved. I think also Dumbledore's grave was engraved with something, but for the Potters, it's the last enemy that shall be destroyed is death, which is a biblical quote, which we've talked about because we had that passage from 1 Corinthians in the past on this podcast, and so we got to like make the explicit, hey, look, it's literally quoted in Harry Potter.
Yeah.
But thinking about the gravestones and the ways that what we write on gravestones, like what the purpose is in that and why we...
Or even having them in the first place. I mean, a lot of people don't want them at all now, but being able to have a place you can go to visit is a very concrete way to grieve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when I was looking up the gravestones, because I knew there was more than one gravestone that we, like, read the inscription on, but I think it's just that Dumbledore's also.
Yeah.
Because I was looking at the Peverell ones, and Ignatius, they find Ignatius's grave, Ignatius Peverell's grave, but the only thing that they can really make out is the symbol for the Deathly Hallows.
Right.
They don't read an engraving.
That one would be pretty old, so not really a surprise.
Yes, it was like hard for Hermione to read Ignatius Peverell on it.
Yeah.
And that will come up a little bit later. Our second reading for this Sunday is 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 1 through 5 and 13 through 17. The author encourages the readers to wait for the return of Christ in faith. One of the themes that came up for me in this passage was the theme of gratitude. So they, especially in the second half, are talking about giving thanks to the church in Thessalonica and the way that the church is and like all of the different things that like encourage them about the church. And I think we mostly get gratitude when it comes to like Harry, either when he's gone from something, so like remembering gratitude, like how great it was when he was at Hogwarts,
right,
when he during the summers that he's at with the Dursleys, or when he just arrives and he's like, oh yeah, this is so wonderful, when he just arrives at the Burrow each year. Oh right, I love this family and this place, and same for Hogwarts. Yeah, I wonder about Hermione and the trio. I think it's been in some fan fiction and some just other conversations that the gratitude that Hermione maybe felt for Harry and Ron, because she was like not fitting in when she first got to Hogwarts, and I feel for her because I was like that kid that was just too smart for everybody else.
Me too.
And the way in which, as they all started to get to know each other, right, she got this sense of belonging, and she found a place that was not just an isolated place by herself. I think she would have lots of gratitude. And specifically when I read verse 2, I was like, well, this could be advice for anyone who ever wants to read the Daily Prophet, right? Not to be quickly shaken in mind or alarmed, either by spirit or by word or by letter, right? But that's like basically what the Daily Prophet is designed to do, is to alarm people and to like provoke people into feeling uncertain and feeling anxiety, and then they have to, I mean, it's a good marketing strategy, then they have to like know more, and so then they like keep buying it. But
we've never seen that in modern newspapers. No, of course not.
No, that's not how TV covers any sort of tragedy at all. No, all the time. Yeah. So, verse 2, advice to not read the Daily Prophet. Which is not actually advice that I ever give about newspapers. You should read newspapers, they're important.
Well, with a grain of salt. Take it with a grain of salt, yes.
There we go, yeah. Speaking of the grain of salt, and not letting anyone deceive you in any way, I was struck by how much verses 3 and 4 really sound like they're describing Voldemort. So the deception and then this rebellion against the way that the magical world is functioning, which is kind of true and kind of not. Like, the magical world was pretty broken anyway, but
Yeah.
the real, like, rebellion against the laws and the rules that had been set up to at least try to protect muggles and try to protect the more vulnerable in the society. And also that Voldemort is the one destined for destruction. And he does oppose everybody else and tries to put himself in the place of God, in the place of the most powerful.
Right. Yeah, I agree. That does sound like Voldemort. When I read verse 4, I thought to myself that it seems like over the last several years, one of the pieces of advice that I keep giving out, especially to like teenagers, is that you really don't want to worship people. Like, you don't want to worship individual human beings or groups of them. It always ends badly. People are imperfect, they will let you down, and it's not going to end well. But then there's the other side of things, which is human beings who want to be worshipped, and that is a whole different level of being screwed up. And it's not just about wanting admiration, which is a fairly normal human drive, and it's not necessarily a bad thing as long as you don't let it, control your life to an unhealthy degree. But wanting to be thought infallible and perfect and wanting to be worshipped, that's a big part of what leads Tom Riddle to become Voldemort. And that's also not going to end well. So.
Yeah. Definitely not.
When we reach verse 15, this verse over the years has been misused to demand holding on to traditions that hurt people, when the gospel is the most important tradition we have and demands otherwise. And other verses that are similar to it in the Bible have also been used in the same way, the hold on to tradition verses. And that's much like how holding on to Professor Binns long after his death and, frankly, usefulness is hurting the next generation of the wizarding world.
That is so true! Yeah. Oh my gosh.
I mean, traditions can be good and useful and can lead you in good directions, but also the other way. So.
Yeah. Yesterday, I was at a trivia night to raise money for local students who are doing anti-racist work.
Cool.
And the trivia was really good, but part of it was like civil rights leaders, and then part of it was Iowa civil rights, and it was amazing. Like, I'm not from Iowa, and so like my knowledge of Iowa's history is way more limited than I would anticipate it being for folks who grew up in Iowa.
Right.
And also, like, those were the things that not many people knew.
Right.
And there were questions there even about like more broad, like national civil rights stuff that I was like, I don't know that, because like what we teach and how we teach history matters so much, and we've done a terrible job of it.
Right.
By and large. And Professor Binns is like the key example of make history boring so nobody pays attention, so that there's no ability to do a like intentional social analysis or critique about how the world is operating.
Yeah.
Which is one of the soapbox that we get on.
We have a handful of them, and deploy them as necessary. We keep needing them anyway. Our gospel reading for this Sunday is from Luke chapter 20, verses 27 through 38. Local religious scholars who do not believe in the afterlife ask Jesus a question about it and marriage. Jesus explains that marriage is an earthly custom and God focuses on the living.
So I don't know about you, but I've had my fair share of like theoretical questions or like devil's advocate stuff in my life.
Theoretical questions are great. The world does not need more advocates for the devil, I'm just saying.
No, it's true, and most of the time those are employed particularly against oppressed and marginalized people who are talking about justice issues.
Yeah.
But that's like part of what I was thinking about with this is like the theoretical questions about something you don't even believe. Like, you were just doing it to be a pain and to diminish the person or to cast doubt or aspersions on the person you're asking.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about that, and that we don't get that a ton. We get it a little bit with Umbridge, but then I was also thinking about like basically every proposal or idea that Lockhart ever has is just a theoretical question, because none of them work in a practical sense.
Right. Yeah, I don't remember any particular devil's advocates from the Harry Potter world, except for maybe Zachariah Smith in the meeting to found the DA.
Right.
It's not exactly a devil's advocate situation, but he's he's in that same vein, I think.
Yeah.
But his questions actually make sense if you don't, know Harry. So you can't really argue with him that much.
Mm.
So, reading verses 27 and 28 as we begin the passage. This passage does not actually say that these guys who are talking to Jesus are trying to make trouble for Jesus, or that they're being disingenuous, which kind of surprised me, to be honest, when I was rereading this passage, because I think I've always heard it read and interpreted that way, that they were just trying to make trouble for Jesus.
And I think, as Christians in particular, we have interpreted it that way, which has anti-Semitic, consequences.
Yes, hugely. But thinking about it more deeply, if resurrection and the afterlife isn't a thing that makes sense to you, the question that they ask seems like a reasonable question. I mean, okay, the whole 7 brothers thing, that seems to be taking it a little far, but, if you're going to create a theoretical question, then let's have it be an extreme case, just to be clear. Sure, okay. So, yeah, it also handily illustrates why treating people like property is not a very bright thing to do, as well as also, morally wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like the many questions that Harry and company fielded during the organizational meeting for the Dumbledore's army, which I guess I just brought up a second ago. So, hey, look how these themes interconnect.
Weird. Well, and in verse 29, I was thinking about now there were 7 brothers. And it actually, first reminded me of the Peverell brothers and, the way that the story of the 3 brothers starts.
Yes.
Now there were 3 brothers, and this was the thing.
It's the story. No, sorry.
Also the Brady Bunch.
Yes.
But then I was also thinking about 7 brothers, and the Weasleys have 7 siblings, 6 of whom are all brothers. And so thinking about what that looks like and the way that the story goes. And can you imagine? Bill and Fleur don't have a kid. Bill dies. And then Charlie and Fleur marry. And Fleur's maybe not the best example because she's part Vila. But Hermione would have none of that if it were
I can kind of see her marrying Charlie if something happened to Bill, but I don't see her going any further down that line. I'm just saying.
Yeah, no. Definitely not.
Someone would die and it wouldn't be Fleur.
Yes, exactly. If things continue as they are, we have a couple guest stars today. Their names are Penny and Jessie, and they're puppers, dogs that are hanging out upstairs. And we're not sure. It's only the second time they've hung out together, and they're both crated, and so there's a little bit of trying to figure out who's who and who does what, and
yes,
all of that. So if you hear that in the background, this is probably a one-time situation, so consider yourself lucky that you get to hear the dulcet tones of Penny and Jessie barking.
Also, I don't actually know Morse code, but if one of our listeners does and it turns out that the dogs are secretly communicating secret messages or something, please let us know.
Yeah, if this is Morse code, I would love to know. I don't know it well enough.
Yeah.
My grandfather used to do a CB radio, but I don't know it well enough to do that. Anywho, I really love a lot of Jesus' response to the question, because of course he's not going to answer the question. He's going to be the entire premise of the question is wrong. He's better than a politician.
In so many ways.
But he, I feel like Jesus' answer really keys in on the ways that relationships, especially significant relationships like a marriage, provide and encourage a sense of belonging or longevity in a place. And so that reminded me, Harry and Ginny's relationship is a perfect example of that, right? When Harry's I have to go do this thing that's scary and dangerous, and I don't know if I'm coming back, his first inclination and the thing that he does is to break up with Ginny and be nope, this can't be a long-term thing for me to be able to do the things that I need to do. And he, like, says that it's also for safety and to protect her from Voldemort. But, like...
Yeah. Harry's 17. We don't necessarily take everything that he says seriously.
Yeah.
Not specifically because he's a 17-year-old boy, but because he's a 17-year-old in general. So, yeah.
And it might make him feel better about what he's doing, but, like...
Yeah. When we reach verse 35, this verse is usually interpreted as saying that after we die, our marriages no longer matter. And this is one of those Bible verses I actually don't like. We're allowed to not like Bible verses. That's okay. I don't like that idea as a married person. And if you're wondering why, imagine trying to tell that to Arthur and Molly Weasley.
Oh my gosh.
No, that's not a conversation I want to have. Also, they're just going to yell at you. Of course they continue to matter. Whether or not they're, like, legally binding, I don't know. But humans have partiality. There are some people we like. There are some relationships that are more important to us than others. We are not anywhere near as impartial and impersonal as this verse would imply. And I went to all that trouble of finding my husband in the first place, and I'm not letting him go that easy. So.
Yeah. Although I do think it's complicated for people who, like, have a spouse die and then later get married again.
Yes.
But also, like, I do think that our relationships, whatever after death looks like, if there are, like, still semblances of humanity and heaven in the sense that is fairly commonly talked about in our, like, Christian dominant culture.
Right.
I do think, like, the relationships are going to look very different, in the way that, like, love is expressed and valued is going to be way more radical than anything we have created room for in this country.
Yes, absolutely. One of the understandings of heaven from the Bible, I don't remember exactly where the wheat and the chaff parable is in the Gospels, but it's in there somewhere.
Mm-hmm. I think it's in Luke.
Yeah.
We had it this year.
Yeah, probably. But the idea that the worst parts of ourselves, the impulses that don't come from God, that those will be burned away and we won't have to worry about them anymore. That means that when we go to heaven, we won't have a list of people we want to avoid necessarily. Like, if I walked into a room that was filled with all the people I'd ever met, there would be some people who I would want to go find, and there would be some people who I would want to, not under any circumstances interact with. And presumably that wouldn't be an issue in heaven. But I think that even after we die, that there are going to be people we'll want to go find.
Yeah. Well, and I think about, like, the number of times I see, like, I think when Justice Scalia died, I remember some friends saying something along the lines of, may you be surprised.
Yes.
By who you find. And I think that's a really powerful thing, especially when it comes to, like, discrimination and who's has enacted and enforced discriminatory policies, that, like, you're going to be surprised by that. And it's not right to then, like, also say, like, and all of these people that you have oppressed are now in relationship with you. Like, there has to be an accounting for harm done kind of thing that doesn't just, put all of these people who have been abused into...
Yeah, no.
Our second Sunday for this episode is the 23rd Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Proper 28, also known as Lectionary 33, which this year falls on November 17th. Our first reading for this Sunday is Malachi chapter 4, verses 1 through 2a. The prophet promises that those who do evil will be burned up, but those who revere God will rise up. So one of the themes I noticed in this passage is a theme of restoration, of a rebuilding and a renewal. And so then I was thinking about the restoration, the rebuilding of Hogwarts, and what that would have looked like. Because there's a sense of urgency to it, right? Like, if they want the next year to have an academic year, they have, like, a couple months to rebuild Hogwarts.
Yeah, I have to say, like, the end of May, beginning of June is not really the greatest time to have a major battle at a school. That just seems like bad timing.
I mean, or it's the best because then you get to say nobody has to have finals and
given the number of
you
people
get
who
a couple
died
months.
I'm not really sure that the not having finals thing was that huge of it, but yeah.
You know, but you also get a few months before people are coming back. But
Right.
I do think that like rebuilding Hogwarts could be this beautiful thing for the magical community, where all the Wizchids get to like come together to rebuild and to be intentional about like caring for the damage that was done to the building. And there's a way
Right.
in which that sort of like physically caring for other things can help people also process emotionally and like come to terms with what happened, and also like think about, make the connections to the future and to the students who will come to Hogwarts.
And even rebuilding a relationship with the
Mm-hmm.
people who you're rebuilding with. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I have to say that I looked at this reading and I stayed a lot more close to playing Captain Obvious. This reading is really, really short. This reading is a verse and a half long, and I know that some people are really fond of having short Bible readings, but this just seems ridiculous. I don't know that I object, but this just seems like ridiculous.
Real short.
I think
Yeah.
this reading is actually shorter than Trelawney's prophecy about Harry and Voldemort.
Definitely.
The prophecy involves like 80 or more words.
For the which one of them?
The prophecy by Trelawney about Harry and Voldemort.
Both of her prophecies individually are longer than this passage.
This episode is brought to you by the number
The number 60, which is how many words in this passage. Speaking of this very short passage, I was struck in verse 1 by the like naming of destruction, that evildoers will be stubble and the day that comes shall burn them up. And I was thinking about like in the Battle of Hogwarts, this is only in the movie, so it only kind of counts. But in the movie, as
but more
they
than Cursed Child. You know, there's a spectrum of these things.
differently than Cursed Child. But in the Battle of Hogwarts movie part, when Neville and Seamus like basically put explosives all over the bridge, this like bridge that doesn't actually exist in at Hogwarts, and then like the first of the Death Eaters to like try to come in when it's protected, like that does not go well for them. But then once the protection spells are broken, then they like can go through, and so it's like ah. And so Neville starts running across the bridge, and then they set off all of the explosives. So that was like that whole big ornate bridge just like goes into stubble. It goes into like rubble and gets burned up.
Yeah. When we get to verse 2a, we're only paying attention to the first half of verse 2. We're ignoring the second half.
It's actually the first like 3/4.
Well, yeah, okay, the first chunk of verse 2, which is good because the second half of this verse makes the afterlife sound like a rodeo, and there are no rodeos in Harry Potter, so I have no idea how I would have gotten that to.
Right, but also as someone who
sense.
grew up in Colorado with rodeos, like when I was just now trying to count the words and I saw that, I was like, oh, I like that. I know what that means.
I don't dislike rodeos, but comparing a rodeo to Harry Potter would take some effort, and I'm not sure I could have pulled that one off. But the first half of the verse, which we are paying attention to, what with the sun and the rising and the wings and all that, makes me think of the myth of Icarus from ancient Greece. And I have to wonder if anybody in the magical world ever, tried that, like making wings and trying to fly, and hopefully not flying too close to the sun and melting because, science and all that. But if I knew that magic was a thing and I knew that you could make various things fly, I would be very tempted to make a pair of wings and see if I could pull that off. I would maybe not want to test it myself, but
You clearly have a lot of confidence in your magical abilities.
well, I have a lot of confidence in gravity, let's put it that way.
Gotcha. I mean, there is a certain extent to which magical people have done that in, like, becoming animagi.
True, yes. But it's not quite the
it's
same
not
thing.
The same.
As,
yeah.
I could totally see George doing that. Or, like, if you take the fanon interpretation of the characters, Seamus is often portrayed in fandom as being, like, completely not paying attention to practical concerns and just throwing himself off of both metaphorical and literal bridges all the time. So, yeah, that strikes me as the kind of thing he'd do.
And, like, things frequently, like, catch fire with him, so.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Yeah. When I read that verse, I was thinking about the phoenix and fox, and, I mean, admittedly, it's phoenix tears that have healing properties, not their wings, but also it's like their ability to carry people and like the way that they as a species exist in the magical world feels very similar to what is described in verse 2a.
Our second reading for this Sunday is from 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 verses 6 through 13. The author reminds the readers that while Jesus is going to return, that doesn't mean they can just sit idly and wait. Life goes on, and treating others fairly still matters.
So one of the themes that came up for me was the theme of burdens and being a burden or that sort of thing. And it's hard to tease this out because I think when I read this passage, I definitely noticed that like it would be really easy. And I think people use a lot of this language against people with disabilities to say like
or welfare recipients
or any of those things, to just say like, oh, you're lazy, oh, you don't want to work. And like, we don't live in a world where everyone who wants to can work, and also like anyone unwilling to work should not eat is wrong. That is a terrible statement. Everyone should be able to eat.
Yes.
And there's a difference between like inability to work or not. I don't know. Some days, like, I just don't want to work.
There's a difference between laziness and actual disability. There's a difference. And most people aren't that lazy, is the thing.
Yeah.
Laziness, when you think about it, it usually comes down to not so much actual laziness as exhaustion. Like physical or emotional
exhaustion,
or whatever.
I mean,
executive dysfunction and a lot of other things. And yeah, it turns out that people who have fewer problems in their lives tend to have more energy, which means that they look less lazy to the rest of the world.
Yeah, and so I think that's a huge thing that like I just need to name for this passage, that like this passage has some really problematic stuff.
Yes.
Without contextualizing it, and even with contextualizing it, but like,
I mean, by all means, don't just take a verse of the Bible and quote it without any context, because that doesn't work, and this is a lovely example of how that doesn't work. But also, people have inherent worth aside from their usefulness, and that's a Christian teaching too. So
Jesus fed the 5,000, right? Jesus feeds people not because they deserve it or they did enough work for it, but because they're hungry. Thinking about that in a different context of burdens, I think about Harry and the way that we see a few different times in his relationship with the Weasleys that he feels like a burden to them, particularly economically.
He's a growing boy. He needs his food.
Right, he's a growing boy. He needs his food, and he has the money to like pay for it. But one of the things that is really important to the Weasleys is to provide that and to provide hospitality. And I think they've done like studies actually, and the percentage of money that people living in situations of poverty give away is higher than middle class or upper class folks.
People with less money give more.
And so like
over and over again.
This way of like thinking about the economic burden, right? The real economic burden in this country is the giant corporations who pay nothing in taxes and like those sorts of things. It's not the people who are living in situations of poverty or who are relying on SNAP or Medicaid. Yeah. And I think the Dursleys really embody the problematic parts of this, complaining that Harry is a burden to them and that they're not getting help and that all of those things. And it's like, you know what? Like, you have enough money, you have enough resources to care for Harry. Right. And you made the decision to care for him, and he is your family, and like deal with it. You don't get to like take backsies on a commitment that you make. You're adults. You make
especially not to a child.
Yeah. And so thinking about this sense of like working to provide, and I think like in reality, probably the author's kind of trying to get at like we all work to contribute to the community, and we all benefit from the community. and that sort of not taking advantage of things. But verse 8 reminded me of how Snape goads Sirius in Order of the Phoenix after Sirius is spotted by the Malfoys, presumably as a dog, and gets reported. He can't like go out and do work because he'll get spotted and caught and sent back to Azkaban and all of those things. And so that wasn't a goal of his, and that's certainly not what he wants. And Snape says, oh, you went and got yourself spotted, and so now you get to, like, sit in here and not do anything while everybody else is risking their lives and blah, blah, blah. And it's just like, Snape, really? Yeah. Unnecessary. I mean, I get that they don't get along for a lot of reasons, a lot of which are rooted in Sirius's really poor decisions, and also, like, not helpful. Seriously.
Also, while we're at it, I realize that some of our listeners may be tempted to come up with some kind of conspiracy theory about Emily keeping Sirius in dog form somewhere in the house. But you'll notice that the dogs that you hear barking have much higher pitched and smaller dog-like barks than Sirius would, because Sirius was a very large dog.
So it's true. Neither of them are Grimm size. They're medium size or small to medium.
Yes.
Don't worry. Although that would be wonderful and I would love that.
Also, I think they're both girls.
Yeah.
When we reach verse 9, you know, it's funny how when this passage is misused to give crap to people who are on welfare and so on, this verse gets completely ignored. Like, I honestly, I read this verse and I thought to myself, have I ever read this verse before? This is not familiar. It just confused me. So wait, so they're saying that they had the right to eat without paying, but that they wanted to set a good example? Is that it? Or is the author saying that they are special? Or does this actually apply to everyone? And is this verse actually just a takedown of the evils of capitalism in general?
Also, when I read that, I was like, pastors deserve to get compensated for the work we do.
Yes, funny how that works. And also, like, if there's a potluck, please let us take a few minutes to sit down and eat. Please. We will be in such a better mood and do such better work if you just let us eat. So somehow I cannot imagine Harry insisting on getting free food at restaurants after the war because of all the stuff that he did for people, or, you know, going in and, like,
I mean, he would probably get it anyway.
I mean, people will offer, probably, yes. Much like Florian Fortescue used to give him free ice cream. But I don't think he's going to go around demanding it. That's not who he is.
Yeah. Yeah, that doesn't strike me as...
Slughorn, maybe. But...
Lockhart, definitely.
Well, if he ever gets out of St. Mungo's, poor guy. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was thinking, so that's that sort of, like, quietness in action that you're kind of hinting at with Harry, and, like, not wanting to, like, draw all the attention and get all the things for free because he can.
Humility, yeah.
In verse 12, we hear about those who do their work quietly and earn their own living, and I was just thinking about, like, Professor Sprout and Professor Flitwick and the ways that they go about the work that they do as professors with so much integrity, but also this quiet
steadfastness.
Yeah, this quiet groundedness in who they are and what they're doing and why they're doing it. That's just beautiful.
I also enjoy imagining the looks on their faces as various hijinks take place around them and they say to themselves, yep, that's the twins. Yep, that's the trio.
Right, which we get...
glad they're not in Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw.
Right, which we get, like, with the swamp in Order of the Phoenix, that Flitwick's like, I don't know. And then, like, once Umbridge is gone, he, like, gets rid of it, except for this little corner that's just like, this
Very
was
stubborn.
Impressive. Well done.
In verse 13, we hear the author say, do not be weary of doing what is right. This actually reminded me of, I don't remember which reading it was, but there was a reading in our last episode that kind of made the same point. Justice is not a one-and-done thing. It's a long, hard slog that you have to keep fighting for. We like to point out how the wizarding world isn't perfect after Voldemort's defeat. There's a lot of work left to do. Hermione has a lot of work left to do as minister once she gets there, that sort of thing. You have to keep putting in the effort.
Agreed. And it's a lot of work, but yeah, there is this, like, encouragement and exhortation to persistence in this.
Yes.
Which is helpful these days, especially.
Yeah, we need to hear that a little bit more.
Our gospel reading for this Sunday is Luke chapter 21, verses 5 through 19. Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple and the deaths of the apostles, and also proclaims that they will endure forever. So a theme for this passage was persecution. And I just, like, every time we talk about persecution, I always go back to Order of the Phoenix, right? Jesus is predicting the persecution of the apostles and those who follow him. But then also, like, Order of the Phoenix is the place where all of the persecution is really obvious, partly because that's where it happens to Harry. Yeah. But I was thinking about, like, Muggle persecution is just beginning in Order of the Phoenix, right? With, like, the regurgitating toilets and shrinking keys and those sorts of things that Mr. Weasley talks about it a lot and really well, of, like, why it's problematic that there are regurgitating toilets or that there are shrinking keys, and that sort of Muggle baiting and, like, bullying of Muggles who don't know what's going on, like, who can't wrap their heads around the fact that their keys might be shrinking, is really problematic.
Although if it was going on in this decade, I think it would be more likely to be shrinking cell phones that vanish.
That would be glorious. I could get mine that would, like, shrink, and then I'd need a point at which I could, like, freeze it and make it stop shrinking.
Okay, but I was more going along the lines of that's what people are constantly, looking for these days, rather than,
I mean, yes, that's also true. As we look more specifically at the verses, I noticed in verse 5 they're all in awe at the temple and how it's ordained and how beautiful it is. And I was thinking about how Malfoy Manor probably gives that impression as well, that it's just, like, so well put together and all of that stuff. But then I was thinking about it, and I don't like the connection with Malfoy Manor as much, because the temple was, like, yes, it was beautiful and well made and all of those things, but also, like, the heart of it was that it was intended to be a place where that beauty and that splendor drew people into wondering and marveling at the splendor of God in that place and at the way that they were able to be in relationship with God, which is not a thing that Malfoy Manor did. Malfoy Manor was designed to, like, intimidate people.
Right. But the temple also was not designed to draw everyone in, or at least not everyone in all the way. So, like, in terms of the only certain people are allowed in certain places and certain people are better than others, I think it does have that in common with the manor.
Well, I don't know that the temple would do, and certain people are better than others, but I do, at least not explicitly. I do think
the Israelites versus the non-Israelites, I think that's pretty in the descriptions of how the ancient temple worked. But yeah, it depends.
It depends. But I think even then it's more similar to Hogwarts to me than to Malfoy Manor. Because Hogwarts doesn't let everyone in, right? Hogwarts is designed so that if you are a Muggle, you have an impulse to leave. Like, there are Muggle repelling charms, but also, like, all you see is kind of this broken down building that's, like, kind of in ruins.
Yeah.
And so I think that fits the, like, not everybody is welcomed in and not everybody belongs at Hogwarts or in the temple, but also, like, Hogwarts is beautiful and magnificent, and it's supposed to draw you in to wonder at the magic of the place and the magic that will be learned there. So I think it actually, like, works really well.
Yeah. In verse 6, the end of the temple is predicted. Everything ends, even beautiful ancient things. Which brings me to wonder what will finally bring around the end of Hogwarts. And what will the next magical school be like after Hogwarts? Will it perhaps have central heating and staircases that don't wander around?
It will definitely continue to have staircases that wander.
Well, what if there's elevators? Will the elevators wander?
Yes.
Will you just be able to, like, float up and down
elevators?
Up and down levels instead of having stairs or elevators?
I think you could float, right? Like, I think you could do something
or little
like
magic carpets.
Magic carpets or something like that for folks who would, in the Muggle world, use, like, wheelchairs or other devices to get around.
They're students. They'll want to use it for fun.
I mean, yes. I think they should be accessible to whoever wants or needs it, but I think magic carpets would be part of it. But I could see, like, better ceiling on the windows.
Yes. the central heating thing, I don't think anyone would argue with. A stone castle in Scotland has got to get awfully cold.
I bet that a new school would be powered by like solar power and stuff. Like they would have figured out.
Wait,
charms.
Are you saying that electricity and magic would be able to work together?
I'm not 100% positive. Yeah, but I think like heating water, like I think they would create charms that like would be self-renewing charms or something that would be powered by like solar power or wind power or water power. Renewable resources in the magical world to death and destruction.
Welcome to HB at Church.
Yep. Yeah, as like we hear about earthquakes and famines and plagues and dreadful portents and great signs from heaven, that could very easily describe the Second World War. And so I was wondering how many of the Muggles thought that the Second World War was, like, how many of the Muggles, like, read verse 11 during the Second World War and were like, oh my gosh, it's happening, now is the time, ah! Because there were, right, like, whether it was the giants causing, like, rumblings in the earth and earthquake-ish things, or the Dark Mark as, like, portents and signs from heaven, famines and plagues, the giants again would like destroy crops and all of that stuff.
Yeah, I take the line, you shall know neither the day nor the hour, very seriously, and so I would love to be able to use this explanation when people come up to me and say that, Pastor, don't you think the world is ending? Well, no, actually, it's just the magical world that's, having a fight, and so we have to... Now, I don't think that would work very well, but it would be nice.
Yeah, I don't think people would buy it, but I would. I'd go down that path with you.
And then in verse 16, we hear that you will be betrayed by parents and friends. Like, for example, Xenophilius.
How so?
He betrays them.
Oh, he betrays
Luna,
them.
But he is a parent who betrays them. He doesn't betray Luna, particularly, although...
That's where I was like, yeah. He doesn't betray family, but he does betray them for family.
He betrays her cause. And also, I would say that the Dursleys are an example of being betrayed by parents or, people in loco parentis close enough. Harry is definitely betrayed by them and how they treat him.
Yeah. I wonder...
Fundamentally, all people are flawed and will disappoint you.
Yeah.
At some point.
Although I wonder what the reconciliation was like between Luna and Xenophilius after the war.
Because, yeah, that must have been a conversation.
She would be one to say, like, Dad, why did you betray Harry? Like, to not just be like,
right.
Oh, I'm glad we're... Like, she would have that conversation with him about, like, a cause greater than herself.
Yeah. Our final Sunday for this episode is the Reign of Christ, which this year falls on the 24th of November. The last Sunday of the church calendar before Advent begins a new year, this Sunday commemorates Jesus as the supreme ruler and distinguishes the ways that Jesus' reign is distinct from humanity's typical rulers. This year particularly focuses on Jesus' power made vulnerable in suffering. If you want an example of being vulnerable in suffering by the powerful from the Harry Potter world, the example that immediately came to mind for me was Dumbledore being willing to die so that Draco would not come to harm.
Yeah. I think one of the things that we have to be careful about, or at least I try to be intentionally careful about, is it's not just that Jesus suffered, but that, like, he had the power, right? And so...
He chose.
Yeah. And so Dumbledore has all the power in the that, like, we could imagine, and if he wanted to, could defeat Draco, could be fine, and yet he chooses to let Draco, like, not to let Draco win, because then the wand allegiance wouldn't change, but after Draco disarms him, he chooses to believe the best in Draco and to believe the possibility that there is still good in Draco and that Draco could make a different decision, and he goes down that path far enough that he does end up dying.
Yeah. Our first reading for this Sunday is from Jeremiah chapter 23, verses 1 through 6. God promises, through the prophet Jeremiah, to gather the sheep who have been scattered by other shepherds, and to raise a member of David's family to be a wise ruler for them.
So, one of the things that Jeremiah kind of calls out in this is the way that those with power have neglected people or abused their power. And I can't help but think of both Fudge and Pious Thickness. Like,
Yeah.
Fudge does it more intentionally and on his own to neglect the responsibilities that he has to care for the magical community and abuses some of those powers. Umbridge abuses a lot of those powers. But then also Pious Thickness, which, like, he's Imperiist, and so it's like he's used, but, like, the Death Eaters who are controlling him are the ones who make it so drastic of neglect and abuse of power and in rounding up all the Muggleborns and that sort of thing.
Yeah. As we read the beginning of this passage, we find the sheep metaphor. The sheep metaphor for the people of God is pretty standard in the Bible. It just keeps popping up over and over again. For those who are not from agricultural backgrounds, the ancient Palestinians certainly would have herded other types of animals with shepherds as well. The other two popular options that show up a lot in the Bible being cattle and goats.
Mm-hmm.
Now, really large herds of cattle would have been more rare than sheep or goats, as they're very big and they eat a lot, so they cost a lot of money. And goats are way more ornery and troublemaking and
smart
and likely to get smart and likely to get into trouble than sheep. So sheep are chosen as the metaphor for the people of God because they are, on the one hand, renowned for not being very bright. And I once heard them described as every morning the sheep are surprised by the grass. They are pretty biddable on the whole. They're pretty easy to lead, although if they get riled up, they can still cause some damage.
Mm-hmm.
So, as a metaphor for the people of God and how the people of God tend to act in the Bible, that's not terribly inaccurate. That kind of works.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're looking for a Harry Potter canon parallel for that, think of the sheep as being like Hogwarts first years. Think of the goats as being like fourth years, capable of getting in a little bit more trouble, knowing just enough to be dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
And think of the cattle as being seventh years, who are in the midst of the worst growth spurts of puberty and just, eating Hogwarts out of house and home. Also, I've worked enough with 11-year-olds to know that they could make some trouble, but on the whole, they're a lot more sheep-like than the older years tend to be.
When I was thinking about verse 4 and we hear through Jeremiah, God says, "I will raise up shepherds over them who will shepherd them, who shall not fear any longer or be dismayed, nor shall any be missing." And thinking about that as this beautiful promise after the Voldemorts, that that's the promise and that's the hope and that's what people are working towards. And then I also it made me think about Frank the Muggle.
Aww.
The Hangletons, little Hangleton, I believe.
Yeah.
And that he goes missing and nobody really notices except for Dumbledore. But in those different things, the ways that people go missing and who notices and who doesn't notice and how we notice and
right. In verse 4 also, we see that God raised up different shepherds than those who raised themselves up, who also scattered the flock.
Mm.
As it turns out, who the leaders are, who chooses the leaders, and why those leaders are chosen makes a huge difference to any group. Think of, for example, Hogwarts in Book 7, where the teachers are chosen from a very different pool of people, versus the other books.
As long as you discount the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor for most of those.
Well,
yeah. Yeah, I think it does matter a lot who is available and who isn't. And I think about the ways that systemic oppression is at play, right? And what pools of people are available to be chosen for things and how much harder it is for people of color or trans folk or people living in situations of poverty to even get to be in a pool that might be picked from, let alone be the ones that are actually picked. And yet, in terms of justice, there's a much greater awareness of how injustice is at work in those communities, right, that it would be much more helpful to have them be in positions of leadership and decision making, and yet they don't have access in the same ways.
Yeah, there was a conversation I had with a congregation member many, many years ago when I was an intern, where they were trying to figure out who they were going to get to preach for their congregation after I left, and they wanted to pick a local retired pastor who was from a very different denomination, which I shall not name. A perfectly nice guy, actually. I spoke to him several times, and he was delightful. But the Lutheran theology and way of looking at the Bible and the way that that denomination did, wildly different.
Mm-hmm.
And this congregation member looked at me and said, "But as long as he preaches the gospel, it'll be okay, right?" And I had to explain that, the Bible can be interpreted to mean very different things, and they went with him in the end, and I'm sure that they're doing okay. They've left the ELCA, but that was not really a surprise. But just, I'm sure that he preaches very faithfully, but just who you choose to speak and who you choose to lead matters, and that changes things. Yeah.
Yeah, when I am in the role of pastor, I always try my best to pick people for pulpit supply and stuff who have different marginalized identities from mine, to be intentional about making sure that there is space made and that people have the opportunity to hear good news and to hear preaching from people who don't look like them or act like them or talk like them. And that makes a huge difference. And I've been limited when I've tried to find pulpit supply, because some of the pulpit supply I've tried to find, like, if a building is not accessible, there's a limit on which people you can actually ask to come and lead.
Yeah.
Or when you can and when you can't. And yeah. And I think, like, speaking of the names of denominations and how they impact us, I was thinking about verse 6 and the new name, which will be the becoming one, is our righteousness. God is our righteousness. And thinking about name meanings. And of course we have Remus Lupin, aka Werewolf McWerewolf.
Yeah.
But also, while I was like looking up the gravestones for our conversation from the first Sunday in this episode, I was reminded of Ignatius Peverell. And Ignatus in Latin, like, the primary meaning is unknown, which is very telling, because that's part of it, is like the unknown of the Peverell brothers, like how they did the amazing magic that they did, but also if Ignatus is the one with the invisibility cloak, like part of having the invisibility cloak is to be unknown, to be able to move in the world in a way that keeps you unknown.
I'm not usually a big fan of giving kids, like, really esoteric names, but I kind of like this one for a child, because you don't know who they're going to be yet, do you?
Yeah. Well, and, like, the other pieces that they brought up of, like, other possible meanings for that name were, like, forgiven, strange, unacquainted with, ignorant of. So there's, like, lots of different ways you can take it.
Yeah.
But I do love the idea of someone being named unknown, because we don't know.
Right.
Our second reading for this Sunday is from Colossians chapter 1, verses 11 through 20. The author praises God for all that God has made in creation and for sending Jesus Christ, through whom God reconciled himself with all. So one of the themes that I noticed for this passage was the theme of reconciliation, which is a difficult concept in the church, I think, because particularly for predominantly white churches, when we think of reconciliation, it's easy to, like, go directly to reconciliation in response to harm, especially systemic harm. And
if you're the one who hasn't been harmed.
We just want to make it all better without actually addressing the harm and, like, trying to do repair to the damage for the damage done. And so
without actually reconciling, basically.
Yeah, there's no space for reparations when we jump to reconciliation. And so thinking about the way part of what is needed in reconciliation is a sacrifice and humbling of those who are in power, and especially who have abused power. So thinking about, like, Umbridge would not have been able to reconcile with Harry without owning the ways that she caused harm and working to address those and change those. And then also, as we were talking about Xenophilius and Luna in the last Sunday's gospel conversation, I was thinking about like what reconciliation with them would look like, and I think Luna would like at least need acknowledgement from Xenophilius, that, and like a naming of his being scared and the way that he put his fears above the concerns of other people and the concerns of what Luna herself was working towards.
Which strikes me as unusually ironic given his name that means loving others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How does that square or not square?
Yeah.
When we get into the actual like specifics of the verses, I went really like direct and explicit in these ones for this passage. It's like, may you be made strong with all the strength. It's like, oh, well, just take a strengthening potion. That'll fix that. Done.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe not.
I mean, physically. There's a whole other like mental and emotional strength that's...
I don't know if there are potions for that.
I don't think even magic.
I mean, if the magical world believed in therapy, then they might have bothered developing something like that. But as far as we can tell, not so much. Yeah. When we reach verse 13, we hear about the powers of darkness. And we have previously, in this podcast, discussed the importance of being careful with using light and dark imagery for good and evil, especially as it's used in the Bible. And actually, come to think of it, we are coming up on Advent now, and that's a very popular image to use in Advent. Mm-hmm. And the reason we need to be careful with this is because it has so often been translated or interpreted as white people equal good and not white / dark-skinned people equal evil, which is racism and also no, not true.
Yep.
But if you're talking about light and darkness, instead of about shades of color being light or dark, if you're talking about like the actual thing of light and darkness itself as a concept, darkness can also be understood and characterized scientifically as an absence of light particles. Mm-hmm. Darkness itself is not a thing or a presence of something. It's just that there is no light there. Light is a thing. Darkness is an absence.
Also, the thing that I love is that the bright light that's like all light is actually a compilation of all of the colors of the spectrum. And so there is like, you can't have light without all of them being there.
Light that looks white to us is there. All the colors are in it. Yeah.
Which is like this beautiful like counter message to what we have deemed whiteness and lightness to mean.
Yeah. I guess I came across that concept a lot earlier than most kids did because my dad was an AV guy. And so I was taught about the difference in mixing colors on television versus mixing colors with paint pretty early.
Yeah. I learned about it in art class.
Nice. In parallel to this, there's also a philosophical idea which is like not anywhere near as solid and certain as the scientific idea we just talked about, because it's philosophy and that's how philosophy works. Yay! That evil is not itself the presence of a thing, but instead is the absence of good or of love. Like when evil people are described as having empty eyes or empty hearts. I hear that a lot, and that's kind of the absence of love. I'm not entirely sure I buy that idea completely about how the universe works, but it does make a certain amount of sense, and it definitely comes to mind when I think about Voldemort, and specifically about Tom Riddle growing into Voldemort. What we see of him does look like an absence of love to me, and that really seems to be his characteristic problem.
Yeah, that's definitely how Rowling portrays him. Yeah, that's a really... I like thinking about it like that, because that also gives more agency for, like, what would it have been like for him to grow up and have just one more person who cared about him.
Yeah, the light and darkness analogy is used so constantly in the Bible and in our hymns and so on. It's going to be a while before we can fully address that. So while we are stuck with it to a certain extent, we have to be careful about it, but that doesn't mean there's not useful stuff in there. So
yeah. Well, and when we get to verse 15, I was thinking about, like, Christ is the image of the invisible God. And so thinking about the invisibility cloak, and that the invisibility cloak, when you're wearing it, is invisible, but when you're not wearing it, like, it's visible. So there is a visibleness of the invisible. And the movie does a horrid job of portraying it, because in the movie it just looks like some form of like fabric.
Right.
But in the books it's described, well, very similarly to how the movie just like depicts unicorn blood. I think about it as this silvery, watery thing that's somehow held together like fabric, but it feels like silvery water and looks like that. I think about that as like the visibleness of invisibility, that it's this like alchemical
mithril
thing. Yes, a little bit like mithril. Oh, I would just like to point out that you brought up Lord of the Rings just now.
I also like Lord of the Rings. I'm just a little less obsessed than you are.
I know, but I just think it's like fun to like point that out occasionally.
It also makes me think about Jesus as a teenager and the trouble he could have gotten up to with an invisibility cloak. And is that actually how he snuck away from his parents to go hang out in the temple when they went to Jerusalem?
He just slipped the invisibility cloak on and...
I have stuff to do. I can't be bothered with these people.
That's hilarious.
I mean, man, what I wouldn't have given for an invisibility cloak at the age of 13. Holy cow.
Right.
And then in verse 18, we get this metaphor of Jesus being the head of the body, which, again, also common metaphor in the Bible, talking about Jesus and the church. This description of Christ, however, always sounds a little silly to me, like there is a head that is floating somewhere in space. No, that's not. No.
That's fantastic.
It's a very weird way to describe a person.
Yeah.
Unless you grew up with it, in which case it's still weird. But when really what it means is that Christ gives Christianity is also known as the body of Christ. Christ gives us direction. But it also reminds me of a way of sorting fictional characters that I ran across many years ago. When you have a central trio, or maybe they're not central, maybe they're like side characters and you don't get as much information about them, but each one of the three has a defining characteristic. You'll notice that there is often, the trio is often set up so that one of the three is ruled by emotions, the heart character, one is ruled by rationality, the head character, and one is ruled by action, the hand character. You can see this with the trio in Harry Potter, as Ron being the heart, Hermione being the head, and Harry being the hand.
I don't know. Okay, but hang on. We gotta talk about this. I am with you 100% on Hermione being the head.
Yes.
But I don't know if Harry's not the heart. I mean, I know everybody thinks Ron is the emotional core of the trio, blah, blah, blah.
Because you love Ron so much.
And also, I think Harry is really driven by his emotions and by the emotional bonds and connections that he has and that he feels towards people.
Right, but he's also, of the three of them, he is the one who is driven to action the most. Like, Ron and Hermione do things, but it's often at the direction of Harry or others, and they usually go to the others of the trio before acting. And Harry will totally just run off on his own.
Valid. Okay.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, Ron is definitely not the head, and Ron, I would say, is definitely not the hand, because I don't know if it's characterized as because he's such a younger sibling or not, but he's not a leader. He doesn't tend to put himself forward and take direct action very often.
True.
So,
True.
the trio of characters that I learned this characterization trick with was from Star Trek the original series, with McCoy as the heart, and Spock, of course, as the head, and Kirk as the hand. So,
interesting.
Our gospel reading for this Sunday is from Luke chapter 23, verses 33 through 43. While being crucified, Jesus is mocked by Roman soldiers and promises one of the criminals on a cross next to him that they will be in paradise together.
One of the themes for this passage is the way in which, and I think it's true every Reign of Christ, but the passages that are chosen particularly from the gospel for Reign of Christ are the most on brand passages for describing Jesus.
This is Jesus at his most Jesus-y?
Yeah. And there's been some stuff going around Facebook and Twitter about what's the most on brand story about you as a kid, which is just really fun to to think about. I can't think of one for me, but to see what other people say about themselves and be like, oh yes, that is so you.
I think mine would be, I remember this happening, but my parents eventually realized that grounding me to my room was not terribly effective because all of my books were there. And so I was perfectly happy. I was an only child. I was good. I was going to probably spend some time there anyway. My bed was nice and comfy. So eventually they had to learn to, like, sentence me to do yard work instead. But that is about as on brand for my childhood as you can get.
That's fantastic. I corrected math teachers.
Nice.
Like, frequently. I actually had a math teacher who was like, "You're smarter than me." I'm in middle school.
Goodness.
This is problematic. But, so I was thinking about the most on-brand moments in Harry Potter, and, like, Hermione going to the library when she has her epiphany in Chamber of Secrets is super on-brand for her.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was thinking about any time Ron is around snacks or sweets or has them at all. Like, that's...
And then he shares them.
Yeah. I was trying to think of, like, what would be a super on-brand thing for Harry or for any of the other characters.
Running off to the ministry without, like, talking to anyone, and then,
getting everyone killed.
Yeah. Well, not everyone, just serious.
It's
only his godfather, whatever. Yeah. Or just the general caps lock and shouting in the 5th book.
Yeah. Or, like, anytime Hagrid is at all connected to some sort of magical creature is super on brand.
That he's not supposed to have.
Yeah. I'm not supposed
Norbert, no birder. Yep.
Yeah. Or letting a secret slip.
Yeah.
So there's, like, all sorts of different kind of super on brand things.
But I love the concept of Jesus being extra Jesus.
Yeah. So what do you think, dear listeners or watchers, is the most on brand example in the Harry Potter books of someone being extra themselves? Is there a particular thing that Draco does that is just that Draco-y? Let us know what you think.
While we're at it, if you can think of a moment from the podcast when we were super HP at church, we'd be interested in hearing that too.
Right. Or individually, when Kay was super
Yes.
Kay and I was super Emily. Also, it's kind of funny, I just realized that
Emily-ish.
both of us have, like, our names ending in Y.
Right.
Yeah.
Emily-ish or Emilish? Emilicious? No, probably not.
Maybe not Emilicious.
Okay.
Emily-ish?
Okay.
Emily-ish?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know.
Sure.
On a less lighthearted note,
Aww.
I know, but it's Jesus crucifixion, so, like...
Yeah, this is HP at church, so awkward segues into, terrible
That might be the
depressing
most
and
HP
death
at church.
is- Yeah.
But in the beginning of this passage, we have the description of Jesus being crucified, actually, like, crucified. And I was thinking about, like, we have all of these different examples throughout the books of people being harmed because, they're fighting a war and stuff. But the thing that I think most parallels this for me is actually after the Quidditch Cup that night when the Muggle family is being tortured. And just, like, the helplessness and the, like, shame and both psychological and physical torture that they experience. Yeah. So that was kind of the thing that came to mind, and it sucks.
In verse 41, we get this criminal, shall we call him criminal number 2? I don't know how to refer to him. He is in the process of being crucified, so, immense, massive amounts of pain. And he is being very politically aware. He explains to the other criminal that, Jesus didn't actually do anything to get crucified. This is unfair for him. We are totally getting what we've earned, but he's not. I can't imagine the amount of effort it takes to, like, describe political situations while you are actually being crucified and, like, mocked by a crowd. That stuns me.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we usually pay attention to that, but wow.
Yeah, well, in particular, I was wondering this time that we read it, like, what they did, because crucifixion was a particular tool used for people who were not supporting the Roman Empire.
Yeah, these guys were not just, like, random thieves. They didn't, like, steal people's purses in the marketplace.
They
or
were,
something.
like,
This would have been political prisoners.
Sedition or something.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Or leaders of a rebellion or something. Yeah.
Part of what... Yeah.
And going back to Harry Potter, Harry probably could have benefited from some extra political awareness like that in Book 5 while dealing with Umbridge's detentions and so on. I really don't think that him keeping quiet about it was the most effective thing he could have done. I understand why he did it, but...
It was not politically... Yeah.
he could have done more with that, and having the political awareness and truly understanding why Umbridge was doing that. I think that could have helped him.
Yeah, he definitely, in his responses, in his reactions to Umbridge, does not display any political awareness whatsoever.
Yeah, if he had talked all that stuff over with Hermione, I think it would have gone better.
Well, and maybe, but even McGonagall tries to talk about it with him and explain it, and he just, like, doesn't care, isn't...
I mean, he might just not have the spoons for it. He's got a lot going on, but still.
Right. PTSD and all that. When I read 42, every time I read verse 42, I can't help but, like, the song, Jesus Remember Me, always pops into my head. And that reminded me of just, like, the different really well-known quotes that we have. That there are certain quotes that are just so well-known from the Bible that, like, most Christians probably, like, know the song or know this particular line. And then thinking...
Like with Zacchaeus in our last episode. And the song.
Sure, except that I didn't. But yeah.
I know you didn't, but
yeah, like Zacchaeus.
Many of us did.
But so then I was thinking about, like, the different quotes from Harry Potter, that there are particular quotes that, like, everybody knows. And we all probably, like, quote them slightly differently. Because I think we all quote, like, this particular verse a little bit differently depending on what version we read it in.
Oh, I still quote Psalm 23 as, like, bits of it are still from the KJV, even though I haven't used the KJV for eons.
Right, me too, yeah.
But, yeah.
So then I was thinking about, like, Dumbledore's quote in the first book of, "To the well-organized mind, death is but the next great adventure."
Aww.
And it's this beautiful thing, and then as I was, like, typing it up, I didn't double-check it, so there are a couple words where it's like, is it this word or this word for the particularities of it? But that's, like, what we do with quotes. We slowly paraphrase them into, like, something slightly different and slightly different and slightly different. But with the same message at heart, hopefully.
And then finally in verse 43, putting the comma in a different place in this sentence can change the meaning of the sentence hugely. Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." But if you move the comma and you put the comma after the word today, he says, "Truly I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise." Is it today that they're going to paradise, or will this be some other, like, time in the distant future when they will be in paradise together? Because the thing is, ancient Greek did not have commas. Well, they had a slightly different punctuation mark that was used in a similar way, but it was used way, way less often than we use it, and it does not appear in this sentence at all. So where you break up the sentence is up to context. Yeah. And now, historically, usually, the comma has gone before today, and so then we get the phrase, "Today you will be with me in paradise." But, I mean, we're pretty sure, but there's no way to be certain.
But also, there's a way in which it makes more sense if it's in a different place. Like, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, it can go either way. This is one of my favorite ways to explain to confirmation students that, actually translating the Bible is hard, and we think we have most of it down pretty well, but we're still finding things that people have screwed up over the centuries. And some things we're never actually going to be sure about, and part of adult faith is that you don't actually get simple yes or no answers to all your questions.
Yeah. Well, and there are, like, places where, like, the footnotes will say, "The Hebrew of this text is unclear," or whatever.
Yeah. And depending on which translation you're reading, it will say that for different verses. And that reminds me, if I'm going to take my, like, random weird trick of language in the Harry Potter books and look for an example of that, my favorite example
I love this one.
will always be when Harry uses the intricacies of how English is understood to be able to use the line on Snape of, "You don't have to call me sir, Professor." Language is tricky, but you can use it for your own ends.
Yes.
So.
I love that. I love that. And sometimes that's where I go with, like, the turn the other cheek and stuff, right? It's the, like, subversive.
Right. Yeah. Use the rules against themselves. And I particularly loved it because, again, I love when there are bits of levity in depressing stories, and that is a very depressing section of Harry's story. But that line just gave me life.
Yeah,
So,
I love that one too.
much like the twins exiting Hogwarts at the end of the 5th book. Not the end, but yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah. Well, thanks for joining us for this episode and for our whole 2nd season. Catch us next time when we begin Year A, also known as the Year of Matthew, and discuss Harry Potter connections to the scripture readings for the beginning of Advent. Also, if you have ideas for what our next season could include or could look like, let us know. This is the perfect time for us to try out new things. So, this is the perfect time for you to make suggestions and have ideas about it.
Yes, Christians and Lutherans particularly can try new things.
Every 500
we
years.
just like to encourage that.
It's been about 500 years for us, so we're due.
Always reforming. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Roloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and WordPress, all at HPATCHURCH. Or contact us at hpatchurch@gmail.com. This season, we're also putting our episodes on YouTube, and we will continue doing that next season, where you can listen and see subtitles. So make sure you let your friends know and search for us.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you appreciate what we do or want to be able to go back and listen to older episodes or get actual transcripts of the podcasts, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/HPATCHURCH. Not only do you get access to special insights or mentions on our episodes, but you'll also be helping us be more accessible and sustainable as a podcast, which is important to us, since not everybody has a quick quotes quill to help them.
As the ancient Christians said, Pax vobiscum.